From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Over the course of American history, there have been 47 presidents elected to the White House, a journey which for many has been marked by controversy, dating all the way back to George Washington. It's this history that retired Boise State University professor Blaine Davies looks at. In fact, he'll be talking more about this topic next week at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise. And he's joining us now for a preview. Blaine, nice to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
So I'm very curious because you teach about this history. How did you get started in this area of research?
Well, I do lectures on a variety of topics. And since I'm retired, I typically pick topics that interest me. This one does interest me, but it was a little bit of an exception because I was asked to give this lecture actually by a library here in San Diego where I live in October of 2020. And at the time, I really hadn't anticipated that we would hardly talk about the 2020 election at all. But that, of course, is before everything happened. But I've been interested in presidential politics for a long time, and it was kind of my specialty when I was teaching American history at Boise State.
What have been, in your opinion, some of the most controversial elections that you've studied?
Well, probably the first one that was really quite dramatic, and it's what prompted the passage of the 12th Amendment, was the election of 1800. And in that election, before the passage of the 12th Amendment, the candidate that was at least ostensibly running to be vice president was really on a par with the person running for president. So in this case, there was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, even though the political opponent was really John Adams. So that was the first election where the contest was actually decided by the House of Representatives. And it was a tie for many, many ballots. Each state gets a vote. And it was finally resolved in Jefferson's favor when Alexander Hamilton, who wasn't a fan of either man, finally lent his support to Jefferson. And soon thereafter, we passed the 12th Amendment. It was finally ratified by the states in 1804. And the rules have been pretty much run as it's defined in the 12th Amendment ever since.
What about the Hayes versus Tilden election in 1876? Tell us a little bit about this one.
Well, that's an interesting one for a variety of reasons. One is because in many ways, it kind of paralleled what happened in the election of 2000 with Al Gore and, of course, George Bush. And it was another instance, one of, I think, 5 in our nation's history, where the individual that won the popular vote did not end up winning the Electoral College, and as a consequence, it was that candidate that won. In the election of 1876, Sam Tilden was the Democrat. He won the popular vote, and it was controversial because they actually ended up setting up a commission to decide who the ultimate winner would be. It ended up being a 15-member commission with 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and they all voted along party lines. And in the end, Rutherford B. Hayes became president of the United States. And there's been some speculation that it was part of a deal that if they allowed him to proceed, that he would remove the federal troops from the South, and that effectively ended Reconstruction.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so you mentioned the Bush-Gore election in 2000. So I do want to kind of talk more about modern times now and modern elections. Which ones have you paid most attention to in recent years? Well,
that one certainly is an important one because it's another case where Al Gore won the popular vote and it's pretty clear in that particular election that if Ralph Nader had not decided to run for president and siphoned off not a whole lot of votes, but enough votes in Florida that it, of course, there was the whole controversy with the Supreme Court and the Chads and all of that. But that would have been academic had Ralph Nader not run, because then Al Gore would have won Florida and he would have become president in 2000, would have won the election in 2000. It's a little interesting that what often happens when a third party enters, such as it did in 92, that the candidate the third party candidate tends to siphon off more votes from either the Democrat or the Republican that is probably otherwise most closely aligned with their own views. I think you could argue that most people that voted for Ralph Nader, for example, in 2000, had Nader not been on the ballot, would have probably voted for Al Gore over George Smith. And again, we had a similar circumstance in 92.
So, what presidential election or controversy do you personally find to be the most interesting?
Well, I've never thought about it that way. Other than, sometimes it signals a major change in our political situation. So, for example, in 1824, we had another case where it was the House of Representatives that decided the election, this time in John Adams' favor. But in 1828, when we first started out as a country, the only people that could vote were white men with property. But the rules loosened up in 1828. And so that was an interesting election because now in most states, just white men in general, whether they paid taxes or whether they owned property, were now eligible to vote. And that's what it made it possible for Andrew Jackson, who was really our first populist president, to become president of the United States. So as the vote has expanded, and then ultimately to women as well, that has certainly changed the political landscape. So that election is interesting from that perspective.
How would you say elections have evolved? And really, since our very first president, since George Washington was initially elected?
Well, I think the biggest change is just the expansion of the vote. I mean, if you kind of go through history, just kind of expanding a little bit on what I just discussed, when George Washington was elected, it was only white men with property that could vote. Then some states started making it possible for white men who at least paid taxes but didn't necessarily have property, they could vote. Then in 1828 and 1830, they expanded even further that as long as you were a white male in most states, because again, it's the states that decide this, white men could vote. Of course, we had after the Civil War with the 15th Amendment, then black men, but still not women, could vote. So that expanded the electorate again. And then, of course, I believe I have the right year, 1920, women were granted the right to vote through an amendment to the Constitution, and that changed the landscape again. So over time, that's expanded. And the other thing in some states is changing the vote in terms of the age. Instead of being 21, it became 18. And so that was another instance where over time we've expanded the group of people that are eligible to vote.
I didn't realize that it used to be 21 years old to vote. That really does change things, doesn't it?
Yes, and as I recall, I don't remember the exact timing of all this in all the states, but I think some of it, as I recall, had to do with Vietnam because, you make the argument that you were sending 18 years over there to fight and die. Maybe it would be reasonable that they would be allowed to vote as well.
Yes, one would think. How do you think voting rights have impacted elections over the years? I mean, you talked about, certain groups of people gaining the right to vote. Do you think that has changed the trajectory of really who is placed in office over the years?
Yes. And in fact, being at least officially giving the right to vote and having the right to vote are not necessarily the same thing, because particularly in the South, until pretty recent times, Black people were effectively excluded from voting through processes like poll taxes, literacy tests, and other things that, fortunately, I think that situation's improved quite a bit. But certainly that it changed the political landscape because at least since the time of Roosevelt, most Black voters have tended to vote Democratic. Prior to I'm talking about Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy Roosevelt. Prior to that, they tended to vote Republican. After all, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. But that, again, shifted with the election of Franklin Roosevelt.
What do you think we can learn by looking back at these elections?
Well, I think, at least in terms of our values as a country, I think expanding the vote to as many people as we can is probably a good thing. It's certainly useful that as many people as possible participate in our democracy. Certainly, the whole concept of the Electoral College remains controversial to this day. If you go back to the
Hmm.
Constitutional Convention, there were a lot of things that were done essentially as a compromise just to get the Constitution passed in the first place. And the Electoral College was one of them. It tended to give more power to the smaller states. And that's probably even more so today. And in that regard, I think currently the system tends to favor smaller rural states in terms of their proportionate amount of political power, most of which today tend to be Republican states. And it's one of the reasons why, frankly, we've had cases where the candidate that wins the popular vote doesn't win the election because they don't win the
Hmm.
electoral college, which is also a reason why I think it's unlikely it will change anytime soon, because frankly, it's not in the interest of the Republican Party to change the system.
Before I let you go, what are you hoping that people will take away from your upcoming lecture?
Well, I think I would hope that they would gain an appreciation for our system and how it's evolved, and I think overall has improved. I still think there's personally plenty of room for improvement. I'm personally not a great fan of the Electoral College. I think a popular vote is a fairer way to do it, but but I also accept the reality that that's unlikely to change. But still, to go from a country where only white men with property can vote to a country today where men and women of all races can vote is certainly a big improvement.
Well, I want to thank you so very much for taking time to talk with us today. Really appreciate it. We've been speaking with retired Boise State University history professor Blaine Davies about some of history's most controversial presidential elections. He'll be talking more about this topic on April 30th at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Boise. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.